LEAD San Diego, in partnership with Sempra Energy and Wells Fargo, presents LEADerTrends, a series that provides progressive ideas and advanced thinking about leadership issues. Tonight's program features journalist Claire Shipman, offering her observations on leadership in a changing world.
When I moved to Washington in 1993, coming back from Moscow, and from the moment I got there, I was really struck by the enormous amount of cynicism, not only in Washington, not only from the politicians, but also the journalists were cynical. The public was cynical about the politicians and the journalists, and it was as though everybody assumed every politician was absolutely no good, that all of the government agencies were no good, that nobody in Washington was doing anything of value, that the country might just be better off without Washington. And this existed really before the Clinton scandals started. Cynicism was already in overdrive, and I think they contributed to it, obviously. But to fight with my news directors about getting a Washington story on the air, they rolled their eyes. Nobody wants to hear about Washington. If it was a Washington story, it had to be critical about all of the politicians because everybody knew politicians just couldn't do any good. And it was disheartening to be involved in that and to be forced to play that game to some extent. After September 11th, it really changed, I mean, for obvious reasons, but it was still stunning to watch. I think Washington was re-infused with some of the importance, the significance that it used to have. I think a lot of people in the country started to understand that people working in those agencies, maybe they were making mistakes, but what they were doing mattered, that politicians, the decisions they were making were going to matter, that the government does do some critical work, that those things people think of as big, boring bureaucracies really just shouldn't be written off. I mean, you'll remember the period, it's not true anymore, but when Donald Rumsfeld was the sort of, generating as much buzz with his briefings as a new Hollywood film, and Bush would call him Rumstud, and when that happens, Washington has become a little bit more important. I think some of that atmosphere has already started to fade, but I think that it's a challenge for the politicians there now to be sure that it doesn't, because that's going to be critical for keeping the people connected to Washington and what's going on there and not becoming overly cynical again. But they're going to have to work hard to keep that respect. They can't just rely on a terrorist attack to keep that going. In terms of the leaders themselves, I have been in an incredibly lucky position for the last 10 years in Washington to watch the transformation of a lot of national leaders, and believe me, most of them are transformed by spending time there. It happened a lot with Clinton, and I'll talk about that a little bit, but it's happened most recently, and I think most significantly with President Bush. You are all, to some extent, leaders in your fields. Try to imagine what Bush's leadership experience so far has been like. Just a stunning challenge with almost no way to prepare for it. This was a man who thought his biggest challenge, first of all, was going to be getting elected, but the second was going to be the economy, which was tanking as he was campaigning. But he had a good domestic team around him. He thought he'd be able to meet the challenges. He had done more or less of it, a good job of that in Texas. And his agenda was very much focused on the domestic, compassionate conservatism. Remember that? Haven't heard about that at all lately. But this was, this was his style. This was what he thought people were electing him to do. And he felt confident about it. I mean, some people might have said his ideas were simple, but that was his style, and it really worked for him. I mean, he was the sort of guy people elected because, one, they were tired of the complexities of Clinton, but also there was something likable about him. I mean, traveling with him on the campaign, which I did a little bit and which my husband did a lot of, but Bush would routinely, for example, just run past the rest of the reporters in the front of the plane, the print reporters and TV reporters, and go hang out with the camera guys and sit back there and say, I want to hang out with the people who are drinking. I like drunks. I was one. And just have that, I mean, literally be seen. He'd never say that in public, but he would just have that way of bonding with people that people found refreshing. I think that the biggest, I was remembering what the biggest challenge just this morning, what we all thought was going to be for Bush, right before September 11th, which was the stem cell decision. Do you remember? I mean, people were writing about that as this is going to be the biggest decision he makes, if not of his presidency, of his first term. And he agonized over it for months and months, and people thought he would be judged by it. It was actually a fascinating time because we had a chance to spend a day with him down at his ranch right after he made that decision, and I got some insights into parts of his personality, some of which I think have changed a little bit, but some of which haven't. We were invited down to do a big exclusive interview just as he was making the announcement. And we flew down to Texas, and the first thing I realized, because I'd only conducted quite short interviews with him to that point, was he really hates being interviewed. I don't know if any of you have picked up on that, but he sat in the chair that morning and he felt so defensive. We were sitting outside of his ranch house. He was just angry that I was asking challenging questions. Every time I said, well, what about this? What if critics say? He would cut me off, and he just wanted to get up and out of that chair. And I started to feel, because I'm thinking, okay, I've got to keep these questions up, but he was also supposed to give us a tour of the ranch and talk to us, and I thought, oh, he's never going to take us on the tour. What am I going to do? And inside I'm sweating, thinking, am I being rude to the president? And it was so uncomfortable. And the minute we finished, we got in his pickup truck with a camera, and I sat in the front, and his dogs crawled all over me, and it was a little gross. But I was 7 months pregnant at the time, and it was 100 degrees in August on the ranch. And but he drove me around and just completely relaxed. He was a different person because suddenly, in his own element, showing his ranch off, and then we continued to have the discussion about why he'd made the stem cell decision, his challenges as a leader, what he found different about being president. He was just a different person. It was as though, he just needed to be, he's the kind of leader who needs to be in a situation where he feels comfortable. And for the most part, he understands that now, and his aides understand that. I mean, he still would, some of the things he would say were so sort of odd. I mean, he said one thing, that, of course you have to promise you'll never tell him I told you this, but it was the strangest comment. I remember we had been driving around, and I'd been asking him what had changed in his life since he had become president, and suddenly, I thought that it was almost over, and he took a big swig of water, and he said, oh, that's another thing that's changed since I've become president. I said, oh, really, what? He said, well, I now know the importance of hydrating. I said, what? I don't understand. I guess we all know that, doctor, but why as president? And he said, well, I don't know. They just seem to have water around all the time. I said, okay. I left that out of my report because I thought, people just aren't going to understand it since I didn't. But, that was literally, a couple of weeks before September 11th. And boy, did things change for him as a leader. I mean, he went from, spending time on his ranch with the likes of me and relaxing and thinking about water to, overnight essentially having to take the biggest test the world has to offer, knowing everybody's watching, and knowing, frankly, he really wasn't prepared for it. I mean, it's like one of those nightmares you have over and over again that you haven't studied, September 11th must have been like that for him. This was a man who, during the campaign, didn't know the leader of Pakistan, and suddenly this is on his agenda, every single day, having to make those sorts of enormous decisions. When I think back to how frighteningly shaky he appeared in some of those debates on foreign policy, or the very fact that he insisted the United States was going to be humble and we weren't going to engage in the outside world. I mean, it's just an enormous change of hand he has been dealt. I think what's most startling about all of that, and I've tried to think about why this happened, is that he really lived up to that test. He, at least in the immediate aftermath, overnight, I think he proved he could step into a role he wasn't prepared for. His liabilities suddenly became assets. The fact that he had seemed cocky, a lot of people didn't like that about him during the campaign. It suddenly, he seemed self-assured, and that's exactly what America wanted at that moment. We didn't want somebody debating what we should do. We wanted somebody who was decisive, which was critical. The fact that he might have seemed simple to some people suddenly was viewed as just straightforward and blunt without all of that other talk. I think the fact that he just believed in himself and his talents, although some would have said maybe too much, it served him well. We needed somebody to trust their instincts and somebody to have confidence in what they were doing at that moment. And for me, the time when I really saw the transformation was when he traveled to New York the days after the bombing and stood on the site of that rubble. I mean, when you saw his first appearance, which I thought was frankly terrifying, when he first talked to us on September 11th, and my husband was traveling with him, so I was extremely terrified because I thought, my husband's flying around with this guy. Where's he going? What's he doing? But by the time he got to New York that day and stood on the rubble, and it was completely unscripted, and one of the workers said to him, you know, we can't hear you. And he just grabbed that bullhorn and said, you know, well, here, now you can hear me, and the people who did this are going to hear us. And I think it's that something clicked for him, and for that period of time, he was really just, I don't know how else to put it, trusting his instincts. He was working from his core, and I think everybody could feel that, and it reassured the nation, and I think just worked well for him in terms of making some of the critical decisions that had to be made, because sometimes it may not be as much about exactly which decision is made, but that decisions are made at all. And he managed to do that very well. You know, if any of you follow Bush closely, you'll know there's something of a cult of his leadership style around him. I mean, there's all the talk about, you know, the Harvard Business School style, he's a manager, he delegates, he sits back, he, doesn't read anything more than 2 pages, and his aides will talk to you all about that, and I think that perhaps was effective in the aftermath of September 11th too, but what I'm talking about is something I think less tangible and just more about Bush knowing, feeling confident and hooking into something that became very clear to him, and not being afraid to do what he believed, and not being swayed perhaps by a lot of the other people around him. I think that, I don't know how he feels about it now. Immediately afterwards, I think there was a sense that this was almost a calling for him to deal with terrorism, almost a religious calling. He felt that strongly about it. I think to some extent, when I talk to some of his aides now, that sense has faded. But I would argue that it's, for Bush, it was extremely lucky that he got that opportunity. I mean, horrible for the world, but I think it probably allowed him to redefine himself in his presidency, and maybe saved his presidency even for that period of time. I think the challenge for him now is that it's hard to maintain that sort of focus and link to that, to his core, and I think we're seeing a lot of that now, because everything I'm describing was sort of until about 8 months ago, and a lot has changed for Bush, and I think it's also interesting to look at what he maybe has done wrong to get to the position he's in right now. He's gone from having the highest sustained poll numbers in the 90s that any president has ever had for a sustained period of time, to now his lowest poll numbers. If you saw the recent poll, 49%, I mean, he's back to where he was before September 11th, which is a fairly stunning drop. Some of the recent polls show that a number of the potential Democratic candidates are beating him. I think that's less about the quality of the Democratic candidates than it is about what people are thinking and feeling about George W. Bush right now. Why has this happened? Obviously, some of the factors are beyond his control. Finally, 2 years after September 11th, people are really focusing on the economy again, and that's not going to be good for Bush. There's not a heck of a lot he can really do about the economy. I mean, great debates about whether his tax cut, having it, not having it, would make a big difference, but generally speaking, I think most people feel that's largely out of his hands. And the war in Iraq, that is something he mustered an enormous support for, but what's happening over there now is just not something that anybody particularly likes, and so it's not going to serve him very well. But I think that when you really look at what the state of politics right now in terms of Bush's approval and the Democratic candidates, what's most shocking is we're really right back to being the same polarized nation that we were after the Florida election. We really are. I mean, people, when you look at the numbers of the people who support Bush, and this is what is the most telling, 90% of the people who still support Bush, and it's still a large number, half of the population, 90% of them are Republicans, only 10% are Democrats anymore. I mean, this is about as polarized as it gets. And I think what we're going to see is that it turns out, despite what Bush gained in terms of a leadership style and reassuring the public after September 11th, he is still a very polarizing figure, much like Clinton was, much like Reagan was, unlike Bush 1 and Carter. I think personally, some of the things that have hurt him, and again, some of the things he couldn't control, but are that, again, some of those attributes that had seemed so appealing now suddenly seem detrimental. Again, not necessarily the decision to go to war in Iraq, which I think a lot of Democrats would have agreed with as well, but there's been, when you look at what people really think about it, there's a sense that there was a cockiness about it, an arrogance about it, especially in the way that the foreign policy arm of that was conducted. I think the real problem that he has right now as well is that the Iraq and the economy are now linked. And those are two really ugly things to have linked together. I mean, if you saw his speech, what was stunning about it 2 weeks ago when he came forward to say, this is going to cost a lot of money and here's the reality, his numbers dropped. And that's unprecedented for him. Almost always with Bush, because he always benefits from low expectations, after a speech like that, his numbers go up. Well, I mean, it is true, and it's not, I didn't mean it as a joke, but I mean, with Bush as a speaker, he's not known as an orator. He's not somebody you expect to be able to present something well, and he almost always, people almost always like what he says. And they certainly did not like that. They did not like hearing that it was going to cost $87 billion in Iraq when people here are not feeling that confident about the economy. Well, in fact, I mean, there's some sort of morbid joking about it at the White House. One of the defense officials I was speaking with recently about it, and they get frustrated about this situation too, but said, look, we could probably have better luck getting $87 billion for troops to help Ben and J-Lo get married at this point than to send more troops to Iraq. And I think part of the problem has been not being as straightforward and clear about the issues as the administration might have been. Some people had told me at the Pentagon that they would have liked to have months ago said, look, this is going to take a long time, this is what it's going to cost, and just get it out there and start to get the American public a little bit more engaged in that idea. But I think that it's a lack of candor that as a leader may have hurt him in the last few months. And I think you don't see anymore, I think Bush is beyond the point where people are questioning, is he smart enough? I think that issue is gone. But I think the issue at this point is just credibility and candor. And the thing that strikes me is when you would talk to some of his advisors as they were making their argument to go to war in Iraq, they would tell us privately, some of his top, these were the hawks who wanted to go to war, they'd say, look, we don't know if there are weapons of mass destruction there, but we feel that we have to take a step after September 11th. We need to move to start cleaning up the Middle East. Iraq is the obvious place to do it. We need to, try to create a democracy somewhere as a beachhead and move. I mean, and to some extent, that sort of thing could make sense. And you think, why not just explain what the strategy is instead of all of the confusing signals? And I think that has been part of the thing that has frankly brought his poll numbers down. I'm going to just give a little aside here, since we're talking about leadership, about somebody else who I spent a couple of days with recently, who I think is very interesting to watch as a leader, not necessarily on the national political stage, depending on whether Bush wins again, though he could get a top job, and that is Ambassador Bremer in Iraq. We went over and spent a couple of days with him just after he got there, and he was starting to set up his operation there. And I think he is very impressive as a leader. He, again, because he's decisive, he does not seem to mind making people mad. He doesn't seem to mind making the Pentagon mad, the president mad, the State Department mad, and he really, he comes back and he delivers bad news all the time, right in public. Here's what I need. I don't know why Colin Powell was saying that, but here's what, I don't know why the Secretary of Defense was saying that. And you can tell when he's over there, he has a team around him that respects him and wants to work to get things done. And I think when I saw that, I think if everybody in this country could see an operation like that and understand it, you would feel more support for what's going on in Iraq. And I think that's the thing that this administration hasn't been able to convey very well. And again, I think that part of that is a lack of honesty or authenticity. For me, one key moment was when that I felt where I started to think, I don't know what's going on here, is when Bush donned that flight suit and got on the aircraft carrier. And it's so funny because one of his top aides had told me, I guess the couple days after he did it, and obviously the administration was on a high at that point, everything looked that it was going well. He said Bush couldn't wait to get into that flight suit. He had it hanging in his office for a week, and every time any of his aides would come in, he'd say, you don't have a flight suit like that, do you? I'm gonna get to wear that, and sort of brag about it to the point where they all just got tired of walking into his office. And I think that was the sort of move where you could tell that was how he felt, and I'm not sure that the timing was right for that. So my sense about having watched all of this and looking at some of the other Democratic candidates now is that I think what people are most after these days and what most appealed to them about Bush right after September 11th and may still again is a sense of authenticity and sincerity. And I think when people feel that and can connect with that, they want to support you as a leader. I think that you can call it the John McCain factor if you want, because I think that's what most people seem to be trying to emulate, but a lot of them don't get it right. But I think that is what Americans are hungry for. I mean, we're too sophisticated now to want to just be fed canned campaign ads and believe them. I mean, people look at them and think, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. They want to feel that they know what's going on behind the scenes, that they're listening to a politician who's not afraid to give them bad news and who will be blunt with them. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether Bush can get back to that sort of sense that I think he had after September 11th. It's something that Clinton could manage at times, I think. I mean, we could talk for hours about him and his leadership issues, but I think there were times when you'd watch him negotiating, all night on Middle East peace or going back and forth, and you'd think, this guy really gets it. He really wants this, and you would feel that. And then there were other times where you could just tell as he was talking, he's thinking in his head, well, how is this going to play, and how is that going to play, and that just, I think people started to understand the lack of sincerity in that. Gore could not master it, and it was incredibly hard to watch. He was, behind the scenes could be very authentic and real as a person, but he was just unable to show himself in public. It was horrible to watch. He was in those debates, I think, where frankly, what did him in, where he just was so obnoxious and phony, really. And I think people thought, we just don't like him. I think that the real challenge now, what is all of this going to mean in this upcoming election? Because it's going to be very interesting. First of all, there are some new realities that aren't usually out there for candidates. Typically, if you're not in a time of war, you're looking at, the standard question, am I better off now than I was 4 years ago? Or do you think the country's on the right track or the wrong track? That is usually the question that will determine who's going to win an election. Not this time, obviously, because of September 11th. And Bush really can't afford to have that question asked, because the answer generally is going to be, most people think things all over are worse off. But he is sort of stuck with the campaign he's going to run, which is going to have to be based on the war is still going on, and the war on terrorism, and it's too dangerous right now to change horses. You can't do it. We're the ones managing it, and to make a switch right now would be very dangerous. And I think that is the sort of theme you're going to hear from him, and it's not an upbeat theme, which is usually what people want to campaign on, but that's basically what they think they have to work with right now. I think that the Democrats are going to basically make this a campaign about Bush. I think that Bush is going to be seen as the, essentially I think they're going to try to make it about antipathy toward Bush, which again is not going to be a positive campaign, but I think their sense is that the Democrats, the base, are so fed up with Bush that if they can mine that sentiment, they can win. And I think we've seen that with Howard Dean and his success. He was the only one who sort of tapped into that early and understood that people out there on the left were angry and was able to take advantage of it. And I'll tell you, it's interesting to watch. We spent a day with Dean just a couple of days ago, and what's most fascinating is the internet phenomenon. I mean, he has just hooked up people who just were not interested in politics, and they are feeling like, again, it's back to this idea of authenticity. They're feeling that they are involved in this campaign through the internet, and they are. I mean, that half of the events they stage are staged by their volunteer group that are writing in saying, here's what we're going to do, and it happens, and they're responding back and forth. And I think there's just a real sense of participation that he's giving them, in addition to tapping into the anger about Bush that makes it very fascinating, not to mention the fact that it's an incredible donor base, and he's made sort of stunning inroads raising money. I think Wes Clark is obviously going to be somebody interesting to watch. There's a big debate about who, is Clinton supporting him, is Clinton backing him? It's one of my old Gore colleagues covered the Gore campaign with me, jokes, said, well, since there's all this issue, I don't know if you're watching, that Wes Clark kept changing his story about some things he said recently. I said, well, then it's clear Clinton was advising him, because who else would tell him to be changing his tune all the time? He's obviously getting advice from Clinton. But I think what's going to be somewhat interesting about this election is it's not going to be as much about going for the soccer moms. I don't know that you're going to see people campaigning down the middle anymore. I don't know if you can afford it, because I think both sides are starting to feel it's going to be about energizing the bases. And that means they've sort of got to go this way, which is going to make it, I think, a little bit different than we expected. And frankly, Bush literally can't even afford to work on some of those proposals he hoped he'd be able to, reforming Social Security. There's just no money left. So I think that's going to be the, antipathy toward Bush might be the biggest animating issue in this campaign, which I don't think necessarily is a positive, but it's going to make it very interesting to watch. And I think one fascinating point is going to be to watch Clinton's involvement in the campaign, because he, I'll conclude with one funny Washington moment. We were at an event the other day where ABC was unveiling its political coverage, and the campaign manager for Kerry and the campaign manager for Gephardt were both there, sort of thrown together, and they used to work together, so they were good-naturedly sort of, making fun of each other and everything. And one of them said, hey, did you get the phone call? And said, yeah, we got the phone call. And it was the phone call from Clinton, who had called both campaigns to assure them that no, he wasn't really supporting Wes Clark. Really, your guy's going to win. We think you're the one. We're just sort of doing this to give Wes a boost. So, I mean, he's calling everybody to tell them whatever he wants, which I think is, maybe he hasn't learned the lesson about sincerity yet. But thank you very much.